See the screen now?
Yep.
Excellent, excellent. All right. So the first component that we need to be doing when we're going through risk assessment, because again, we're talking about what the actual dive looks like, and whether you're doing a NIST assessment or whether you're doing an ISO or methodology of doing risk assessment, the key thing is to start by being prepared. I mean, that's obviously critical to do. And so first thing you're gonna do is clarify your scope. You're gonna have to go down and identify what you're trying to achieve as this assessment, right? It could be a full assessment. We're trying to unpack the entire company, and maybe we're trying to just nail down assets to begin with, and then go from there. But you need to very, very clearly define the scope of what you're trying to achieve. And include the criteria for the evaluation of risk. So exactly how you plan on actually discerning the risk, or actually grading the risk, if you will. That's a kind of a silly way to say it, but it's true. And then stakeholders. We've talked about communication being a very important part of risk assessment. And so identifying the people who are the stakeholders in that and that are going to be involved in that assessment is very important as well. So you're making sure that not only you're identified all the key players that you need to be asking questions of, but also people that you need to be informing of as you go through and identifying risk and process and things like that. Who they may not be providing input, but they may need to be as part of that communication chain because they have some stake in that organization. That makes sense? Everybody? All right. The second step, and this is where NIST and ISO start to kind of identify or differentiate. And I come from a more NIST heavy kind of methodology, so I'll kind of let Shay touch on some of the areas on ISO if he wants to. But the first part of NIST is going to be going through and identifying all the components that expose you to risk in your organization. So, hardware, software, data, your personnel, your vendors, all the things that really are critical to your mission, to actually, provide services and goods to your clients, right? So when you're going this is part of your whole supply chain is going to be part of this, as well as, like I said, just your standard computers on the desk and the people involved in making things happen. So, and then we're also going to define system boundaries. So there's when you're grading the risk on an entity, you need to have a bumper car around that entity in order to grade it, because you can inchworm your way out from everything, and you could say that everything extrapolates out, and these computers have this, so that's part of this, part of this, part of this. You need to create some logical boundaries on your entities, so that then you can actually grade them specifically. Shay, you have anything to add to that at all on that side?
Very good.
Excellent. Now the ISO, you're identifying risks really as the beginning. Because as we talked about yesterday, you start out with a framework with ISO, whereas with NIST you start out with your assets. And so with ISO, you're going to actually start looking at internal and external factors when looking at risk to kind of achieve the objectives you set out in that first phase of setting your objectives. And there's a whole slew of sources for that, which include, historical data, documentation, workshops, and expert judgment. And again, this is the methodology that Shay has more of a insight to. So feel free to grab the mic and chime in anytime, Shay, as we go through this. So again, identifying is the separate. Again, there's two different kind of channels that the two different frameworks kind of align with and kind of move you through the process. And so then you're going to have with NIST on step 3 is going to be identifying your threats. Your threats is the first thing, and we talked about that yesterday with Matt. On your threats are the things that can do you harm, right? The threats are someone that's going to pop open a door to a server room that's that may or may not be locked. It's threat actors, outside world. It's phishing attacks. It's those are all the threats that are going to be identified as part of this process. And then the vulnerabilities are the things that those threat actors are going to be exploiting to get into your environment. And so, like we talked about before, like what Matt mentioned in the first day is you got Bob walking down the alleyway, and he's that threat, and the unlocked door is that vulnerability he's exploiting. potentially that kind of thing, or the door itself could be the vulnerability. He could be, it may be that it's not properly secured, or it's not got a good enough lock on it, something like that. So that's on the NIST side. That's really how we're starting out, because you start with your threats, you identify what vulnerabilities those threats can engage within your framework. On the ISO side, you're assessing risks at this stage. You're kind of, they almost work inversely in how they approach the process. Again, because you're starting with a framework and working your way through that from the control side. But you're going to calculate like likelihood and impact of identified risk using a scale. So, you need to be setting a scale during this high, medium, low, that kind of thing. And then you need to identify whether you're using a qualitative or quantitative methodology. And so qualitative versus is low, medium, high. Quantitative is a number system. I mean, obviously, in the Kamanja platform, we use just a combination of both the number scale as well as colors and verbiage to kind of do a good job of conveying to entities where they stand on the risk spectrum. Okay, my side. So then the next thing we're going to have to do is in the NIST side again is determining likelihood. So likelihood, and this is what when Matt was giving the analogy of driving his kids around in the parking lot yesterday. The likelihood of an impact of an impact in your car if you're the only person in the parking lot is very low, right? But when that other car injects itself into that parking lot, now the likelihood goes up tremendously. There's more players in the game. There's more risk involved there. So the odds that something might occur negatively is higher. So you're going to have to develop the likelihood for each of these threats and vulnerabilities as you go through this. And you need to quantify is the likelihood that the actual vulnerability will be exploited. That's what you're actually measuring, right? So when we talk about that door, whether that door is a vulnerability, what's the likelihood if I've got 3 deadbolts, a bar, and some sort of iron arm on the inside? The likelihood is going to be very, very small. Whereas if the door's got a basic door lock on it, the odds that somebody can jimmy it open is going to be relatively high. So when you're assessing, that's kind of how you need to look at things, not so much on the door itself. It's the likelihood that someone could be able to circumvent measures around it. And then on the ISO side, we're actually looking at risk evaluation at this point. So we're prioritizing the risks that we've identified through this process. And I don't know. I'm sure I would love if you would talk to this particular spot a little better.
So first, I want to talk about in general the idea of the difference between both of them, and then deep dive to that slide. So they start the same. Like first of all, let's do identify, understand what we're going to do and who's going to be part of that. This is very important to risk communication because this is what will lead you to success with the risk management process. And then they are kind of splitting a little bit out. So if you remember, the uh, step 2 was like, okay, let's now understand what are the assets that are involved, the computer data, any kind of things that are involved in the NIST, and let's start right after that doing an assessment on them. From other end, step 2 on the ISO, it's like, let's first of all understand the whole process. Let's understand if we have internal risk or external risk. Let's put it on a list. Let's understand where the sources are, where they came from, and only right after that. Move slide. Thank you.
I'm there.
Right after that, on the ISO, they start do the assessment and the calculation, um, which in the NIST they deep dive to threat and vulnerabilities. We will see it later on the ISO. It's a two different methodology, and it really depends on what you are going to do. For me, it's like NIST. It's more simple and easy step. Martin will show you later on a demo how you can do both from our platform and the difference. But yes, like the NIST, after you do the threat, the vulnerabilities on the NIST side, then you go The next slide, please. Then you determine the likelihood of the impact. But first, you want to understand what are the threat and what are the threat and what are the vulnerabilities. Then, what is the likelihood that will happen? From other end again, on the ISO, it's different. You first of all determine what is the likelihood, what is the impact, and only then you determine what are the threat and vulnerability. We'll see it in the next slide. So that makes sense to you, Martin.
Yeah. So yeah, and again, they're very kind of just different ways of approaching risk. So I wanted to make sure that we were kind of outlining that a little bit because I think a lot of people that I've known have worked through the NIST model because you're starting with the things and working out that way, and ISO kind of works the inverse way of that. So, and then step 5 is going to be determining the impact, right? What happens? How big of a deal is it if this vulnerability is exploited? So in the event that that server room door that I keep on going back to in the alleyway gets broken into, right? Regardless of how hard it is to get into that door, we're assessing just how big of an impact on my organization it's going to have. And there's going to be several factors you're going to have to factor into when you're thinking about that, both from a business continuity standpoint. It could be the value of the data that either could be lost or that could be exposed, and there's a host of factors there that could factor into whatever GRC that you happen to like that if you have a compliance framework that you're beholden to like HIPAA or something like that, and that data gets exposed, that's part of that impact assessment that you're looking at there, because that's a much bigger deal than if it's just a bunch of designs that, while it hurts to have that intellectual property exposed to the world, it's not a PII data exposure. And so when you're determining impact, you have to do a lot of thought into what that boils down to, because a lot of techs, like myself included, when I first started looking at things, how is this affecting my process? How is this helping or impeding my delivery to my clients? But there's a much larger scope of things that when you're looking at impact, you really need to be assessing there. Now, step 5 on the ISO side is, again, we're moving to we're at the risk treatment plan and preparing strategies to actually manage what risks we've identified already. And now, if you guys have not heard this trifecta of how to deal with risk, I'll probably mention it multiple times throughout this course. But there's 3 ways you deal with risk. It's you manage it or remediate, if you will. You minimize it as much as you can. You transfer it, which means you move that risk to someone else, or you accept it, really. And so accepting it is, we know that there's a risk involved. It's either we can't minimize it anymore. We have to accept that risk going forward. One of the things our platform does a pretty good job of is tracking both what we assess as a risk as a part of initial, as well as what residual risks involved with that asset when you actually have applied the remediation. So you still know what kind of risks you're exposed to, even though you've done all the things that you can do to remediate the risk. Let me rephrase that. Everything is cost effective to remediate that risk, because at some point you have to accept the risk. Otherwise, you're going to be spending millions of dollars to protect a byte of data. And obviously, that doesn't make any sense. Any comments on that at all, Shay?
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the impact. So I think it would be for both the ISO that we'll see it in the future on the next slide, and also for the NIST from the current slide. So the impact can be on the CIA, which is confidential integrity and availability, but it may have more options like finance, for example. If risk, if for example, I don't know, they act to some platform and that platform have a finance data, or the specific risk can can uh, can expose the company to a major finance fee or something like that. It's a risk it's an impact that should be considered as well. There are a couple more options, but um, in general, this impact it's very varied. So you can add and you can add on that, but the base are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. It's not only on the NIST, it's also in more common risk assessment frameworks.
I think reputation is another one that many people overlook. Is that's another one I've seen a
Yep.
lot of people adding in into the impact component because it's becoming more and more prevalent. News travels very fast, as we all know, and anytime there's a breach of any kind, the whole world. I think I can't remember who I was talking to the other day, but it used to. I think it was Matt. But it used to be that when there was a breach, it was kept quiet, it was kept down low, it was hushed as much as possible. And here in the past, just the past 2 or 3 years, it's come that kind of quick to market knowledge. Everybody knows that something's occurred, and that's not just limited to IT vendors and IT companies. I mean, anyone that deals in any scale with their clients, the knowledge that they've had an issue is hitting the news much faster now. So reputation is a big impact when it comes to assessing risk anymore. All right, and then step 6 on the NIST side is we're actually going to calculate risk, and there's some ways you, but one of the standard ways on at least on the NIST side is you've developed a likelihood, you've developed an impact, and so a good way to kind of get a standardized score across those is to multiply your likelihood times your impact. That way you can get a score, you can average those things of that nature. So I know that one of the common frameworks that's used a lot is CIS when you're doing assessments, and so going through and evaluating each family, if you will. So you're what the ones are assets and so on and so forth. And as you go through those, you can actually get family scores as well of what the risk looks like. So you can kind of break it down for your client or yourselves if you're doing your own internal assessment. You break it down and kind of see where you stand in each one of these categories. There's 18 total categories in that CIS model. But you can break them down and identify kind of, where we're really high here, we're really low here, we really need to focus some time here, that kind of thing. So that's one benefit of that. In the ISO side, you're going to be implementing controls, right? You're going to be rolling out what you've decided to get done, and monitor the efficacy. And that's one thing that, and if anybody else on the call wants to chime in on this, I'd be more than happy to hear what they have to say. But one of the things that I've noticed is that control sets are fired off as a silver bullet and assumed to be working. And one of the things that I've seen very little of, or at least it's not been broadly adopted, if that makes sense, is that the efficacy of those controls aren't being monitored. And so you can put a wall in place, but if you're not watching the wall, if you're not monitoring the wall, if you're not doing logging of that wall, for lack of a better term, I mean, using the IT term, you're not getting good data on whether that control set's actually effectively doing what it should be. And so you can put in all kinds of control sets, filtering things of that nature on your cloud infrastructure or using like cloud-based services. But if you're not doing any kind of SOC monitoring and identifying where things are coming from, what's talking to who, all that kind of stuff, the knowledge of whether or not that control is effective is kind of, we're hoping that's the case, right? And so that's the first thing. You're implementing controls, and then in order to validate that you're still doing it, you need to be reviewing it continually. So not all things can be monitored through logging or that kind of thing. Doing reviews of control sets is another critical component of risk management, because things change, or again, if it's not something you can actively monitor, it falls back to that efficacy of the control. To see whether or not it's having the desired effect, whether that policy, people are adhering to it, whether it's, you set that access control policy, but nobody's really signing into the server room when they should be. But you're checking on the cameras to see if the logs match up with the number of people going in and out, that kind of thing. So that's the regular review where a lot of that comes into play. So on this, I talked a little bit about the families and that kind of thing, knowing where you can focus on. But once you have a score, now you can say, all right, based on the effect on my company, because you've factored in impact, right? Remember, as we went through this, we took impact versus likelihood, And if that a high impact is going to give us, a very good indication of how strongly it's going to hurt our company. And so now that we've got those grades, those numbers, we can go through and start prioritizing risk based on the risk level. And and just like any good plan, I know that when I used to run my MSP, there was a lot of paralysis by analysis when you took on a new client and they just had so much wrong that you didn't know where to go first, you didn't know where to ask for budget first. That this really, if you go through if you're going through the risk management process, it makes this process significantly easier when it comes down to, I need to go ahead and start laying out a plan for my client. I've got quantifiable risk scores based on the impact of my company and what the odds are that it'll actually happen. So now I can actually lay this out based on that number. And now I know what to do first, what to do second, what to do third, so on and so forth. I think that I think it's an overlooked tool set for MSPs when it comes to laying out a budget for their clients. In that they see a bunch of stuff wrong and they just start, all right, we'll do the easy stuff first. It may not be maybe very worthwhile to jump to 2 or 3 steps ahead to the slightly harder thing because the impact is so disastrous to your client that if something did happen, they would cripple them. So that's that phase 7 or step 7 in the NIST side anyway, is prioritization of risk, getting your ducks in a row and so on and so forth. And ISO, we're communicating results now. We're talking to all the stakeholders we talked about in section 1, and letting them know what's going on and consulting through the stakeholders what we've done through the risk assessment process. Anything to add there at all, Shay?
Very good.
All right. Excuse me, my voice is going to get a drink of water real quick.
Faster.
So step 8, we've jumped into mitigation strategies. So we prioritize our risk, and like I mentioned before, now we're going through and developing control sets and strategies to mitigate the risks we identified. And this could be anything from revising or even implementing policies. I mean, I know I don't think any of us have run into a client that had every policy they needed, or in some cases had any policy that they needed. And so implementing control or policies or revising policies, improving monitoring, or again, implementing monitoring or implementing security controls. Those are all things, because there's 3 different types of control sets when you're looking at controls. You have administrative controls, technical controls, and physical controls. All those, you'll be using a conjunction of those 3 to help address a lot of these rules. So when you're developing these control sets as far as mitigation strategies, all 3 of those need to be taken into account. And policies are going to be policies. I think we've all identified, especially on the compliance side, is a big set of the control component, making sure that you're not only developing them properly, but you have a proper methodology to validate that all the end users are attesting to them properly, that kind of thing. And then on the ISO side, I'm sorry, we're going to be going into documenting everything we've done throughout the process, all the risks, all the assessment criteria, and the evaluation results, so on and so forth. We're making sure this is all set down in stone. Anybody that's dealt with or is looked into FTC safeguards know that step number 2 is having a written risk assessment. So this is where you can, in step 8 on ISO, this is where you're actually going through and documenting the thing, and that's where that written risk assessment comes out, where all the things that you've done as far as the process goes has been documented and written as part of that.
Let me add here.
Sure.
The documentation here, it's not only about the criteria, evaluation, and all you have done. It's also an evidence that you actually did what you say that you've done. So if, for example, you said that for doing a specific risk, you run vulnerability scan on every device, document it. It's mean also showing the result of that run in the particular asset or few assets, doesn't matter. So why does it matter? It's because it's, again, help you to communicate it, help you to show it on your report, which it will be in the next few steps. And it's also very important for you to track and see progress, because most of the compliance is around risk management. And the idea of that, it's like all the time, how do I getting better? Because compliance is a journey, it's not a destination. So you all the time need to show progress and how did you improve from assessment to assessment to assessment. And once you documented it, you can have you can make really efficient process that I can understand what actually happened and now and how do you did better from last time. For example, when you do ISO certified, the auditor validate it from many ways, not only from the risk assessment, also from the internal audit, also from the training, from many ways. So also on the SOC 2, all the time. How do you get better? How do you get better? How do you get better? And that's the point of documentation. Yes, this is from the ISO. From the NIST perspective, the mitigation strategies, the mitigation itself. Here, like Martin said, mitigation can be in many ways. You can accept the risk and those kind of things, but you will face in some cases that you can have from your perspective as an MSP, it will look to you the optimal mitigation. Wow, if I have, for example, many viruses on a device, it would be amazing to install antivirus or EDR, MDR, XDR. I don't care. It's like, okay, but it can be expensive to the client. So what are you gonna do? The mitigation that you chose to do to your client, does it fit to his needs? Does it fit to his business model, to his budget? This is a big concern here, because you may think that the best thing to do is chosen the best expensive solution to mitigate that, but in some cases it's maybe not the right case. So this is comes to the first thing, identify. It's not only identifying the it's not only identifying the risk, it's also identify who is your client, what is his budget, who is going to be involved, and what we're going to assess. And based on that, you should try to consider to choose the right mitigation for all the things that we consider on the first step. This is my insights. If
Yeah, and it's a great dovetail into we talked a little bit about right sizing or having the right security tools in place for the organization, and I think a lot of us are very stack bound in what kind of tools we use. And when you use this process, you're able to get an objective look on where you need to be spending the money based on the actual impact on the business. And again, back to Shai's point though, not the budget is going to dictate what you can spend. I mean, you can't spend more than the client's budget on what they have. And so going through and actually prioritizing the risks in that organization is going to help you dial in the most effective security plan. It may not have every control you want in it, but it has the most spend based on the risks that they're actually experiencing. So I think that's a good point there, Shay. Thank you. All
thank
right.
you, sir.
You're welcome. Sorry. Keep it together, Martin. All right. So step 9 on NIST is the same documentation that we talked about before, right? We're going through and putting pen to paper on all the stuff that we found, all the risks that we identified, what their likely impacts are, and then the risk assessment report. We're actually developing an actual document that outlines all the findings of what we've actually went through. This is again important when Shay was talking about documenting that you've done the things you're going to do. It's critical that you have all this information when reports or when meetings were held, when who was involved in the meetings, how the outcome was determined, whether how successful the outcome was determined. All that information needs to be documented. And then on the ISO side for step 9, we're looking at organizational processes, right? So making sure that the things that we've identified and have documented and now make changing are being integrated into the organization's governance, and even more importantly, decision making. I think that's something that you need to make sure that you're helping the culture of the company. And I think that's good. Shai's got a Shay has a point. Go ahead.
No, this is most
Shay.
of the important thing that you ever said till now, because I tell you why. Like, if you remember, we just talked before that meeting about what we're going to do, what we need to do with processes and etc. internally. So, and this is an important thing because when you do risk management, you need to consider not showing to your client, okay, this is what we're going to do, and this is how. You must show them how it's be integral part of the business process, how it's
Mhm.
being part of their daily work life. This is the important thing. It's not, look, okay, I did the risk assessment, take it, this is what we're going to do. Perfect. Once you finish everything, okay, what next?
Mhm.
What next? What I'm going to do with that report? Going to check it every month? No. If you want to do it effectively, you must show to your client, we did it. Now we're going to do it recurring, validate. How? Because it's going to be part of any decision making that you're going to do, part of your culture of the company. This is when, for example, now you're going to flight. You have a business trip. Perfect. During the ticketing order, you need to consider um what risk can be involved on the flight. For example, I take with me a laptop, I take with me an iPhone. The iPhone or the laptop have sensitive data. So what can be the threat? Theft of equipment. What can be the vulnerability? Lack of data. What can be the risk? And etc. So, and then go on. It should be part of those kind of things. I don't say like, on every business to create a risk. Just the concept of how to integrate it to be part of a critical decision making when they handle a company. So, and this is give the risk management more value than just, okay, we did it once, here is the report, let's speak in a while. So it's let you as an MSP being part of their company culture ecosystem on every decision that they do. That
Yeah,
makes
and
sense.
I think it's a great point. I think part of that also is when when you're working in a environment where you're partnering with an internal IT staff, this really arms the IT department with, because they have their seat at the table when decisions are being made. And if they have a well-defined risk profile of the company based on a risk assessment, then justifying security projects, making sure they have the right tools on the daily is going to make their life easier. And you basically help sign up, as from the MSP side, if you're picking up that security work, that's helped feeding your funnel, if you will. And it's basically made it all that sales process that it used to take to go through and try to hammer through why it's important to do X, Y, or Z. You've laid out the process here. And you've armed those assets or allies, if you will, within the organization. You've armed them with the information they need to say this is exactly why, because this is the impact on our business, and that impact is going to be this much money based on downtime. That's going to really arm those IT folks with that, and you're going to develop some really strong allies in those existing IT departments if you're working in colo situations, that kind of thing. Um, I think we've covered this one well.
Yeah.
All right. And then on the step 10, we're going to have review and update for both, right? So we're kind of rounding out the end on the NIST side where we're going to do the monitoring. And I can't emphasize enough making sure that the controls are effective. Again, putting a control in place without validating efficacy is not a control. It's just window dressing, if you will. So when you're doing continuous monitoring, you're making sure that the controls you put in place are actually achieving the goals that you set out for them to do. And then update your risk assessment based on your monitoring and review. And so one of the things I want to emphasize, and it's not really laid out in these 10 steps, but review is, there's a lot of triggers that will justify a review. It's a change in business. It's an incident. It could be a breach of some sort, because that obviously would illustrate the potential of a control failure. Obviously, changes in an organization, that's a no-brainer. You're changing how you're processing data. You're changing organizational structure. There's all kinds of things that flow into that. And so making sure you're doing reviews anytime there's a substantive change and routinely, all makes sense because while your organization may not change, the threat landscape may have changed. Well, let me rephrase that. The threat landscape will have changed because it's always changing and constantly changing, and making your life as a risk assessment management person hard, that keeps us in the game because the threats are always evolving and things are changing in that space. So making sure that you're keeping up not only with their changes but also the changes to the external are important. And then ISO is also regular review, maintain the effectiveness of the risk management because you need to be consistently reviewing it, because risk management is not a fire and forget assessment. It is an ongoing process. Risk management is definitively something that you are doing consistently, because if you do it on the annual, you've got a good 10 to 11 months where you've got no insight, no updates, no nothing, and there's a whole lot that can happen in those 10 months. So keeping your risk profile up to date continuously and managing that continuously is critical for both yourselves, especially yourselves as MSP providers, but also for your clients as well. So anything else, anything you want to say to kind of so that was our.
Yeah, I think let's open it for a few minutes of questions and then deep dive into the quick demo how we can conduct it in our platform very fast.
Anybody have any feedback they'd like to share? Questions they'd like to pose? I think previous employer called it stump the chump.
I have a question. So if you have an organization that is today taking this step one to on that journey, improving their cybersecurity posture, would you recommend that they go with either NIST or ISO, or would you recommend that they go with CIS, since CIS is more prescriptive? NIST and ISO are more subjective, because what I may consider something as a risk, somebody else may not see it as a risk. Am I correct on that assessment, or?
Yeah, so I would say it's not an either or specifically, because you can use the ISO or the NIST 800-30 version of assessing risk with the control set of CIS, right, in the framework that CIS offers, if that makes sense. Okay. And I actually I'm going to be doing a demo here in a minute to kind of show you kind of how we've set it up to make it easy. I would say that if it were me, to be honest, that's kind of how I would approach initially. If you're just dipping your toes in risk management, it's not something that's really something that you've got the kind of got a feel for yet, and you're kind of looking to start working through that process. I think that's a great way to do it, because you can go through the CIS controls, but use that NIST 800-30 that we talked about throughout this whole session. You can use that methodology to assess the risk based on each one of those controls. So, because there's a couple ways you can go through CIS. One is, do they have it or not? And that's one way. But I think it's more effective if you actually are starting to do a proper assessment based on their individual set. Go ahead, Shay.
Yeah. If you don't mind, let me add that. So the question is, how do I know where to start for doing risk assessment? So if you're following some framework like NIST, like CIS, for example, as Martin said, during that, when you're reviewing the control, it will give you the guideline like, okay, now I check that control, and maybe during that check, that validate of the control, you may find a risk, and then you open that risk based on what you find, if that makes sense to you. So this is the most first and easy step for doing that. Yes, Seth.
Well, you sound like you said that with some disdain.
I know.
So
You
it's a
forgot your
great
unmute
series
again.
so far. Does the Kamanja system itself help clients and companies like us decide which framework or compliance to lean towards?
I don't know that it helps you decide on framework specifically, but it does help guide you through whatever framework you've chosen to
So
utilize.
part of our program, I will share that with you on the knowledge base. You have a one pager that told you, okay, if you chose a few question, and then it's guided to choose the right control to your clients, the right framework to your clients. Sorry.
Well, and the reason I ask is I think it's something that's missing up to, back to Degley's point was there are a ton of things out there to choose, and there may be some random tools that point at a couple, variances between each framework, but I think a lot of companies also, especially companies that are starting out down this path of getting themselves compliant or getting themselves into this proper framework, is where to even start on choosing that. And if there's a tool that helps or a tool that can really, your tool obviously breaks apart the difference between each as you're doing it. Say you're this far on one framework, so far on a different framework, but also to help people figure out where to even start in which framework itself, because that would be, I think it takes a lot of the pressure off of companies who are trying to figure out where to even go with this. And you guys are doing a great job once someone started.
Yeah, so we are doing that during the onboarding process. So we try to help them to understand what they need for the beginning. So I can tell you that commonly CSF or CIS are the most first step that we recommended most of the time. But yes, we improve it all the time, by the way, because it's very changed because you need to ask many questions and understand the needs. But you're right.
I said that you're talking about not just like general security frameworks, but you're also talking about compliance frameworks as well, like HIPAA and SOC, or not SOC, but CMMC and ICE or GDPR, that kind of thing.
Yeah, simply because, I mean, again, to the last question before mine was, well, where do we start? What's it going to work with? And I'm not sure if there are many. If I'm going to invest in a system like yours, which brings you guys to the forum today in a sense, and I don't even know where to start. I just wasn't sure if your system had a tool to be able to help someone figure out which one they should be using. Because it is kind of open-ended, right? You need to find one that fits you, but a lot of people don't really know what fits them.
And that's part of the consultant process as we onboard client or partners individually, because obviously we can help you find what suits you for your assessment process and that kind of thing. But when it comes down to individual clients and identifying whether they need ISO or they need HIPAA or they need whatever framework that they're looking at, we'll help guide through that process based on some questioning as we onboard you. As far as the tool goes, I like the idea. We don't have anything automated per se, but I like the idea of that. All right. Anybody else have anything else before we charge on? Degley, did that answer your question? I mean, I want to make sure we actually landed where you were trying to go.
Do you want me to be honest?
I do.
Yes, you did answer my question.
I was bracing myself for a no. I'm like, all right, let's dive back in. But no, yeah, because it boiled, yeah. But honestly, and I'll show you here in the like we're doing a little demo here to kind of show you kind of both methodologies, if you will. But the CI, honestly, for me, CIS is a very straightforward. Again, if you're looking for, because it's not subjective, like you mentioned before, CIS is a very clean platform. I'm not going to say if you go through the CIS framework that you're going to have done a full risk assessment, but I will say it's a great place to start to kind of get a good beat on where the company is overall. I think doing a holistic ingestion of all their assets and personnel and all that kind of stuff, developing in their processes as well, and then developing risk grades based on all those pieces. That's the long-term play. But if you're looking for something to start with, I think CS is a great tool. All right. Well, I guess I'm going to share my other screen here.
Off your fork.
Are we there?
There you go.
All right, so this is our platform, Kamanja, and as you can see, we have a whole host of stuff. Some of you have seen it before, some of you have not. But we document everything from organization to assets, questionnaires, documents, which includes policies, and testing. But really what I want to focus on here specifically is this is the CIS component here that we talked about just a minute ago. Hi, Paul. Hi, JP. How you doing, bud?
You just hear your voice and it goes.
Sorry, I was switching devices. Sorry.
No worries. It was worth it to see your handsome face. So when I go into my CS, there's a couple ways you can do this. So if I'm in the middle of a CIS set, and we talked about early on in the steps that we were talking about, the steps 1 through 10, identifying stakeholders and management, so on and so forth. But in this gap assessment, this is where you're going to be actually assessing against your CIS framework. And we developed a couple ways that you can do this. One is kind of doing I don't know, quick and dirty, but a way that we talked about how NIST goes through and actually says you give it a risk, you give it a likelihood, you give it an impact, and go on. And you can do this by simply clicking into the control. If you want to name it performers and all that kind of stuff, you can. But really, naming your risk, giving it an impact and likelihood, and any comments that you might have in here, as well as the status, will allow you to go through and develop a quick risk score based on. And one of the things we really put this in here for is we understand that a full risk assessment on a prospect is not a viable thing, right? And if you're trying to illustrate to that client or prospect, if you will, where they're at from a standards reference, you need a tool to do so. So what we've done is we've created this ability to go in and add a risk, add your impact and likelihood, and hit done, and then you're able to generate a report based on this assessment, on this CIS framework. And so when you open this up, and I'll swing this over here now. You have a CIS V8 report. It's got the assessment name in here. It's got a table of contents. It kind of rolls through and lets you flesh out basically this information, anything you would want to add to executive summary, as well as introduction. Obviously, we have some fairly boilerplate stuff in here. But then it's going to go through the control sets and say, all right, control 1.1 is implemented, document any comments that you might have put in here. And based on the likelihood that we assessed and the impact, it's going to give us a risk rating. Now, those likelihood and impacts are completely customizable based on whatever scale you happen to want to use. So if we've had some partners use like a 100 scale and an impact multiplier, or sorry, a likelihood of as an impact multiplier, and then the impact being a 1 through 100. You can use 1 through 50. You can use 1 through 10, 1 through 5, whatever that is. But you're going to get a risk rating, and then each one of these families is going to get an overall risk rating as well as you go through. And so it's going to give you a list of everything in the CIS control set. It also has a nice little appendix at the end, and then a total score at the bottom here. And so that's one way that you can run through, like Dagley mentioned before. That's one way you can run through using the NIST methodology by actually going through, taking the individual entities, giving it a likelihood and impact, and getting an overall score. The other way we do it, and Shay, you have anything to add by any chance there that you'd like to highlight as we round out? We're getting close to time here.
You're fine. I want you to show them the other option that I can put a little bit more highlight.
All right. So, and then you want me to go through the risk management component there, correct? Right. Okay. So when you're doing a risk assessment and you start a new assessment here, you're going to give it a risk assessment name, a methodology. This is what we talked about earlier about. This would be the other methodology we would do, and I'm going to do test number 5,000 because we have lots of in here.
Typos.
Yes, he hates it when I go back and check and fix my typos, but I can't. My hands itch if I can't do it. And we're going to use the CISA for this. Hit next. And then you're going to go through and you're going to actually assign a likelihood, impact, confidentiality, and availability spectrum here. And this is where we talked about before about how you can add different parameters, like, you can assess against different parameters like finance, like reputation, so on and so forth. And so the platform lets you actually do that as well. When you hit next, then you have, we talked about the qualitative versus quantitative. So, your hot, low, medium, highs is qualitative. Your 1 through 5 is quantitative. We kind of use a blend here to do both. Once you hit done, now we have test number 50 and we can start that assessment. And you're going to go through and add your individual IT assets, your individual people, your processes, so on and so forth, and generate a risk assessment based on the individual entities. Folks, we're down to 5 minutes here. I want to make sure that we cover any more questions that we have, or any questions about the platform or any of the content we talked
Martin,
about.
show them the report, if you don't mind, of here the risk management. So you show them. Okay, so once you generate, you can in one click generate a report, beautiful executive report. Doesn't matter, choose one of them, only one, the first one.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I haven't downloaded a lot of PDFs, have I?
Yes. So in one click, you can generate an executive report, all of the risks with a full record of changes.
Yeah, I
If you
do like the
scroll
fact
down a
that
little bit.
I want to highlight that, though, is every time this report's updated or changed, there is a documentation of that. Just like
Yeah.
every policy, every document, everything in the platform has change management built into it.
Yeah. If you scroll down a little bit, there you have all the purpose, scope, approach that we have done, all the what is the qualitative and what is the quantitative that we chose, why, when, and etc. based on what you have built. Is the nice metrics, what has been critical, high, medium, and low. And if you scroll down, you will see all the risk, all the beautiful things that no one don't care about and all the time looking for the reds. So all of those threat vulnerability risks can be generated automatically from the platform without you even understand what is mean that kind of threat and vulnerability. We populate it automatically in the platform and generate it. So many of our partners use that as a sales tool because in 3 minutes you can generate executive report, beautiful report like you see, and use it as a sales tool. So and all of that is generated automatically.
And one thing I do want to mention here is that we do have the initial assessment components and as well as residual here as well. So when you're going through and you're doing remediation, you have an accurate assessment of what your remaining risk is after the fact as well. On this report, you can actually see what each of these components have as far as a residual here, if that makes sense. All right. Well, any questions about anything? Any comments? Any applause? Anything? I'll take JP's heart. All right, guys. It was great having you. I want to make sure that everyone is aware of the change. There was a scheduling issue when we forgot that Thanksgiving was Thursday, and so we're pushing the next two sessions
You
to
forgot.
Monday. Yes,
Shame on you.
Yeah, well, I guess that is my job to remember that kind of stuff. That's my job over here. But we're pushing the next two sessions to Monday and Tuesday of next week, so we're not overlapping Degley's time off tomorrow with his kids and family and Thanksgiving on Thursday. So I'll be pushing out the same style. Be pushing out an invite to everyone here. In the that's here as well as everybody else that's signed up, and you'll be getting another meeting invite for Monday. And apparently that's shocking. So anyway, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you all. But just for reference, this is all going to be going up on our YouTube channel once we've got all 4 sessions finished up. Goodness gracious, that's a lot of shocked faces. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate you all, and we'll look forward to talking here soon. Okay, see you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.